What is spiritual leadership? I know you've heard me use the term a lot, and in this podcast, I'm going to go through exactly what spiritual leadership means, why you are being called to do it, and why it's actually so important for us to step into our roles as spiritual leaders right now. Welcome to the Modern Mystics Podcast. I'm your host, Alanna, the yoga doctor. I'm here to help you realize your potential as a spiritual leader and elevate your work in the realm of yoga, mysticism, and spirituality. This podcast covers all of our favorite topics: yoga, alchemy, astrology, divination, spirituality, psychology, ritual, and mystical practices, both ancient and modern. Get ready to up-level your status as a modern mystic. Spiritual leadership is a big term, and there are many ways in which we can go about becoming spiritual leaders. Now, for the most part, my background is in yoga, and it is yoga teachers with whom I have worked primarily for the last 20 years. But this is by no means exclusive of other people who work in other spiritual fields. So, if you're not a yoga teacher for any reason, have no fear. This podcast is still hyper relevant to you, so long as you are interested in stepping into your role of spiritual leadership and assisting others through their spiritual and life transformations. So basically, spiritual leadership is the spiritual version of what others might do as therapists or counselors, mental health therapists or counselors. And I want to be very careful and put like 19 asterisks after that particular disclaimer or statement. Spiritual leadership is not mental health counseling. It is not therapy. All right. That's not what we're here to do. To become a counselor or a therapist, you do have to go to a higher education degree, get your master's in counseling, psychology, and that sort of thing. However, I will describe for you the difference between those two fields, why they are, in some regards, complementary, and how one actually created the need for the other to arise. So we're going to take it back to start with and give you a little history lesson here. Prior to about 150 years ago or so, for the most part, human beings all lived in the same type of tribe or group of people who had the same type of belief systems or religious practice. All right. So prior to 150 years ago, wherever you lived, everyone that you lived with and around believed the same thing you did. It was very rare that there would just be somebody who said, "Oh no, you know what? I don't really dig that anymore," or "I'm not going to practice that anymore," or walked away from something completely that was just unheard of. It's very new that we live in areas with so much diversity in terms of belief systems. So the shift that occurred about 150 years ago was the Industrial Revolution. I know that's not like a super fun, exciting topic, but I'm sure we learned about it in school, and this is where people started moving away from their country towns and into cities. They started living closer to each other. The neighborhoods became more diverse. There was a lot of clash of cultures and belief systems in those times. And another thing was also happening in the Industrial Revolution is that we were industrializing. We were moving away from living off the land, communing with the land. We were moving away from our natural resources, our natural habitats. So we were moving into a much more industrialized space, which also meant that we were moving toward more scientific advancements. Now, of course, we see a lot of these leaps and bounds happening in the early 20th century. You know, I think about all the scientific leaps and bounds specifically in the realm of physics, with the work of people like Einstein or Heisenberg. There's a lot going on at that time. So people were really thinking in different ways, in much bigger, more diverse ways than perhaps they had before. And the other thing that arose around the same time as we were moving out of our towns and, more rural areas into these big cities where everybody was coming together, and we were questioning our belief systems. We were questioning what science was. We were evolving what science was. We developed psychology. So this exact same time period, psychology develops. Started really with Freud and Jung back in, again, the early 20th century. And what they needed to do was address a pretty unique problem that had suddenly arisen around this time. Okay? Because again, prior to 150 years ago, you lived in a place where everyone's religious and spiritual beliefs were pretty much the same. And the people who took care of those belief systems, the people who helped others in terms of their metaphysical life, in terms of their spiritual life, in terms of their psychological life, were the clergy. The clergy of whatever religious practice they were involved in. Those were the trained professionals to answer the bigger questions about, why am I here? What is my purpose? What is life for? Why am I on this planet? What is this big struggle that I'm going through? What does it all mean? That was the work of the clergy, and to this day it remains so. So for those of us who have an affiliation or an experience with any type of religious practice, it's likely that we will have had some interaction with the clergy members on this level, because they do that for individuals within their congregation. So, here we have this really brand new, quite unique, never been had before problem in human history. Never in human history have humans just chosen not to believe something, to stop believe something, to not believe anything at all. Never in human history have humans been like, oh, you know what, I'm going to take a little bit from this practice, a little bit from this practice. I'm going to reject that part of that practice, and, I'm just going to do my own thing. Never happened before. And in growing numbers, it's happening. Statistically speaking, as a cultural cohort, we in increasing numbers are walking away from our original mythological religious belief systems. When we in increasing numbers are not identifying with any one specific religious or spiritual tradition. This is a very, very new problem. And we're not equipped to deal with it yet. Okay? I'm getting to that. Because what I believe, and I don't just believe this, right? I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere, right? I've spent many, many years of higher graduate level education and research looking into this problem specifically, because I know that people like yoga teachers, modern day yoga teachers, are actually primed, probably more than anybody else right now, to solve this problem. So I'll explain more of how and why I mean that. So in the rise of psychology in the early 20th century, we're looking at the mind and we're seeing that the condition of the mind actually has a huge effect on who you are as a person. Holding on to things in the mind can hold you back from who you are as a person. Talking about this, releasing the things that are stuck in your mind can help you to move on and grow as a person. Psychology is very good at that. It does a lot of things really well. And it serves an incredible purpose. However, we must remember that it was developed in this time, in this industrial revolutionary time. And its purpose is to be the science of the mind, and not just the mind, but the conscious mind. Psychology, in most all of its current modern forms, does not tend to the spirit. It flatly rejects it. It ignores it. It says it's not its place, right? That's the place of religion or spirituality. We're just going to deal with the conscious mind, with the mental fluctuations. And so what we're left with is essentially a God-sized whole. All right. Now I didn't coin that term, but I love that term. And I also know that the term God itself can be triggering for many people. So let's explore this a little bit further, right? We, for the first time in history, don't have a collective sense of how to tend to the metaphysical portion of the psyche. All right. Now, you've heard me speak in other podcasts about the structure of the psyche, that in a general way, it's separated into three different parts: the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and the supraconscious mind. The unconscious would be our soul. The superconscious would be our spirit, our ability to connect to things beyond just our physical selves. And that, we walk around looking for ways to communicate or bridge all the parts of our psyche. And that is truly yoga. That's the state of yoga. The state of psycho-spiritual connectivity, where we are in communication, in connection with all the parts of ourself. Yoga is a psycho-spiritual practice. And I didn't make that word up either. That's actually a word. That is a practice of both the psyche and the spirit. So it's not just a psychology, right? Yoga is in some ways a psychology, but it is also a spirituality, which makes it a prime type of practice for us to use for this purpose of spiritual leadership. But we've never had this problem before, okay? So before now, anytime we had a metaphysical issue, we had people to go to, we had clergy to go to who were responsible for our spiritual well-being. We don't have that right now. Unless we, as spiritual practitioners, as yoga teachers, choose and do the work of stepping in to our roles as spiritual leaders. We essentially, for lack of a better term, become a modern day clergy. We become those that others can rely on to support them through spiritual transformation, spiritual inquiry, spiritual crisis, potentially even, spiritual upliftment, spiritual next steps. There are big things that happen in regular people's lives that go completely untended to unless they are actually paying attention to this, and that is the God-sized hole. Because your psyche has some pretty big things that it pays attention to. It pays attention to culture, the experience and the extent, or the experience in which you were born and raised in. It pays attention to sociological events, things that happen in your life right now, like things on the news. Your psyche pays attention to the psychology, the deeper, mental faculties, and it pays attention to metaphysics, right? Every one of us as a human being, at some point in our adult lives, will inquire things like, why am I here? Why is this happening to me? What does this all mean, right? What are the next steps? Anyone who is pursuing a spiritual practice has these questions. Whether they're voicing them out loud or not, they have these questions. And if they don't have an organized place, like an organized religion to go to, where do they go? Now, let me explain some of the really potent and powerful things that clergy members have been responsible for in the past. Not just individual consultations when folks are having a type of inquiry or crisis in terms of spirit, like, what does it all mean? Why am I here? What's my purpose? Those are huge, right? And we get that. If you're a yoga teacher, you have had those questions. I've actually realized that this was a problem that I needed to solve many years ago, early in my yoga career, when I had just gotten a 200-hour teacher training, and suddenly someone came up to me and said, I'm going through a divorce. I don't know what to do. It's not at all what I thought it was going to be. Like, my dreams are shattered. And I think I was probably 22 years old, and I had no life context to understand how to help this person. And having just been through a 200-hour teacher training, I had no training to be able to help this person. I mean, I don't remember what I did at the time, and I hope it was what that person needed, but it did send off alarm bells within me that I needed much more than what I was equipped with to be able to support what was clearly happening in this person that they needed support from. And isn't it interesting that this person decided to go to their yoga teacher for help? We are already being identified as spiritual leaders. We are already being asked to usher folks to their next stage of spiritual transformation. They are begging it of us already. If you get questions from your clients, from your students about their personal relationships, what's next? What's my purpose? What does it all mean? How do I cope with this? I just lost this friend, partner, relative, pet. What do I do? They are already identifying you as someone who might be able to help. They are calling us for help, okay? Because they don't consciously know, right, that like there's this current modern problem of this God-sized hole in the collective psyche because we've lost our clergy. They don't know that, right? They haven't identified that. That's PhD work. And, it's just, but they understand on some level that that's happening, that there is this need and they're asking for this need to be satisfied. So I feel like if you've ever gotten questions like this, you yourself are being called into spiritual leadership, and it is up to you to take up that mantle, to be responsible for educating yourself with what you need to know in order to answer questions like that and support folks in their spiritual progress, right? If you feel that calling, if you get those questions and you want to support people in the way that mystics of all time have supported their folks, their people, you've got to do this, right? This is what we're talking about. This is the heart of what we're talking about. It's not just about being a yoga teacher. I love yoga, but it is not a silver bullet. It does not answer all the questions, and it absolutely does not answer all the questions for our modern Western people and practitioners. Our modern Western people who have modern Western psyches need additional support and something a little bit different, right? Yoga is great and it'll do a lot of things and it'll get you very far. And it has tools and practices that absolutely are incredibly valuable, no doubt. And we will discuss all of those things, right? Meditation on many levels can be very valuable. I think that the teachings of the chakras are some of yoga's most brilliant wisdom in terms of psychology. Chakras are yoga psychology. That stuff is unprecedented and so relevant for the human psyche, no matter whether it's Eastern or Western. But there are some things that we need to address specifically because we're working with Western students. And again, that may not always be the case, right? Of course, we're going to have Eastern students. And if you're listening to this podcast in an Eastern location, then you need to flip what I'm saying and vice versa everything. But the truth holds water that we need to apply the correct medicine to the correct person. And if the person who's sitting in front of us is a Western person, they need some Western medicine. If they're an Eastern person, they need some Eastern medicine, okay? And there is some crossover. There are things that work for both. But we have to be very careful in that application and make sure that it's actually working, it's actually resonant for their psyche and their spirit. So things that mystics who have held this post of clergy for people throughout history, right? Because these are the mystics. I mean, we think of them as usually religious people, and they can be, but in many regards, religion is also mystical, and there have been mystical arms of every religious practice, and mystics historically have been the essential clergy, the priests and priestesses who held this wisdom to deliver it to the people. And the things that they knew were not just the spirituality or religious or philosophical principles of the day. Every mystic throughout history, all the mystery schools who taught the mystics, had their own form of astrology. Why? Because astrology is psychology. When someone comes to you and says, I don't understand why the universe hates me right now, it's throwing all this stuff my way, I don't know how to deal with it, when is it going to end, right? These are questions that psychology itself, Western psychology, can't really answer, okay? But astrology can. Astrology gives us the ability to basically look under the hood of the psyche, see what energies are prevalent, and see what energies are being applied to that individual to cause that situation at that moment. It's not fortune telling. It's not, miracle working or magic. It's a type of psychology. And to have that insight, which is different than the Western medical field, is so critical, okay? Because what we have as spiritual leaders is a very concrete and separate, clear niche. We do not do the same thing as Western medical doctors, right, who have been through medical school. They attend to the physical body, which needs to, that is an important thing. But if someone is saying, I don't know why the universe is throwing terrible things at me right now, when's it going to stop? What does it all mean? A Western medical professional is not going to be able to help them. Even a Western psychological professional, a mental health counselor, is not necessarily going to be able to help them. But a mystic like you and I, we can help them. It's a specific niche. It's a thing that we can do that is different. This is our lane. This is how we stay in our own lane. But because I'm struggling right now, because obviously this is what I'm striving, I'm working so hard to create, is basically a mystery school, a type of mystery school, but one rooted in true higher education. You have to take the responsibility of earning that education. And I'm not saying that you have to do it with me. I'm not the only place or person that you can learn these things from. I just am so passionate about this that I provide this education in case you wanted to learn it and in case you wanted to learn it from me. But I'm by no means saying that it has to be from me, right? There are many places to get education like this. But astrology is something the mystics of all time have always had. And you must take it upon yourself to learn astrology or something like it in order to help people in that different and unique way that a spiritual leader does. The other thing that we get questions about are things that are happening right now, right? What do I do right now? What do I do right now about my divorce? Now, again, psychology isn't always going to be able to help that, and sometimes people are looking for bigger answers, more spiritual answers. So our way, a mystic's way of solving those questions, those immediate questions, it has always been through divination. Every mystery school, every mystical tradition, every religious tradition has its method of divination. And so do we. In the last podcast, I spoke a bit about the tarot, and this is an incredibly appropriate and relevant, alive form of divination for the modern Western person. So it's something to add to the toolkit. Again, to answer these bigger questions, because just a basic 200-hour teacher training it's not going to give you the skills that you need to answer these questions. And if you've been through one, you know that. I know that that's the way I felt when I had just been trained, and I thought, oh my God, I'm so excited about doing this, and I'm so passionate about doing this. It wasn't a lack of passion. I just didn't quite have all the skills that I needed. So to be able to continually educate yourself about the tools that mystics have always used is really important. Mystics have always had a healing tool. And again, healing on a different level, okay? If you have a broken bone, then Western medicine is absolutely the right type of medicine for you, okay? If you have a mental health issue that psychology is primely suited to address, then that is the right medicine for you. But when we have a more spiritual or esoteric issue going on, which many of us do, right? Sometimes those answers don't always come from the Western medical field. We have some really special wisdom we can apply. And for us as yogis, our healing tool is the chakras. It really is. That wisdom is so brilliant. It is the psychology of yoga. And it gives us insight as to what the body is saying when it speaks. The body speaks to us. The unconscious speaks through our physical form. And when we can decode its messages, we have the means of healing ourselves, which is priceless. And again, gives us the ability as spiritual leaders to stay in our own lane and do something different on a spiritual level than mental health and medical practitioners will do. This is basically the third arm of what I might call medicine that we are right now together as a collective creating, because we understand its need. And the culture is also beginning to understand its need. There's a reason why 30 million people in America identify as yoga practitioners. 30 million people have chosen the practice of yoga over something else, which is honestly, it's astonishing to me. All right. Because I know this is going to sound like blasphemy, but yoga asana is not the most complete physical practice a person can do. If they're looking for physical health, there are a lot of other physical practices that a person can do that will actually do a lot better job, right? Yoga asana doesn't do a lot of cardio. There's a lot of imbalanced strength training. That's a whole other discussion and a whole different podcast. But if you think about it, they could do Pilates, they could do calisthenics, they could do cross training, they could do spinning classes, and yet 30 million people say they do yoga. Why? The reason is because yoga has arrived on American soil imbued with this spiritual practice. As much as some big companies have done their best to try and strip yoga of its spirituality, they can't, not completely. People know. People know that yoga is a little bit different. They walk out of a class and they say, I feel happy, right? I feel differently. You walk out of a class feeling differently than you do if you've just done strength training. It doesn't spiritually uplift you like yoga does, right? Yoga will sneak in any way it can, this deeper sense of well-being, and 30 million people are choosing it. 30 million people have yoga teachers that they look for not just physical health, but for inspiration, for relaxation. Those are not normally things that go along with a physical practice. I mean, the asana is the gateway for people to get into yoga, but they are feeling something different. And that is our call, my friend. That is our signal that this God-sized hole that has developed as a result of this industrial revolution, as a result of us in growing numbers moving away from metaphysical practices rooted in religion, spiritual traditions, historical ways in which we came together to question life, the universe, spirit. Our rituals have been lost. Rituals are another huge post that mystics have held throughout the ages. They've provided rituals for people. And what rituals do very specifically, and I want you to hear this, rituals usher people from one state of psychological being to the next, right? They change your psychology. They change your psychological state. So we all have rituals for birth and death. Those are the ones that have stuck around. When you go to a funeral, for example, really a funeral is just a gathering of people. I mean, there's specific things culturally that we do within a funeral, but around the world, funerals occur. People gather to witness the dead. And that is the psychological cue for us that this person is no longer on earth. We may know that intellectually, right? With our conscious mind, this person is no longer here. But psychologically, we need to usher ourselves into that next phase of communicating with them in a different way. And that's what the ritual of a funeral does. We have the ritual of birth. We honor a new birth in many, many different ways, but it is to welcome that soul into being. One of the biggest rituals that we have lost is the coming of age ritual. This is a ritual that occurs, again, in every religion and spiritual tradition. They have a coming of age ritual, but as we've walked away from those native traditions, we've oddly walked away from this one. And so we don't have that psychological kick into adulthood oftentimes without it. It's very problematic. If you've ever met someone who's walking around basically like a grown child, they missed that coming of age ritual. Their psyche hasn't yet gotten the memo that, they're an adult now. And of course we have marriage. That's a ritual that has stuck, pardon me. But we don't have a ritual for divorce. And nowadays in our modern culture, with 50% of marriages ending in divorce, it's a wonder, okay? Because the marriage ceremony gives your psyche the cue that you are now no longer just one, you are two. But without that divorce ritual, your psyche never gets the cue that two are now once again one. So rituals are critical for human psyche, for human spirit. They move you from one phase of being into the next. Rituals have been a part of human culture and history throughout time. No matter where you go, you cannot throw a stick without hitting a ritual. And for us to be devoid of them in modern culture is, it's a spiritual and psychological travesty, honestly. We're not allowing ourselves to usher ourselves into the next phase of being. Well, if you've ever taken a really good yoga class, and I mean a really good yoga class, or any kind of spiritual class, right? Any kind of spiritual practice, you know it to be a ritual. You know that when you leave that practice, you are a different person than when you walked in. And that's a ritual. So we have important work to do. We have to take up arms, meaning education. We have to take up our post as spiritual leaders because we are being asked to do it. Our people who work with us are literally asking us to help them through these amazing and challenging times in our lives. So I ask you, are you ready? Are you ready to step into your post as a spiritual leader? Are you ready to say yes to this call? Because no one is more primed to do this work than you are. And in order to do this work, you must understand it is a great responsibility. It is a different responsibility than our other fellow medical professionals. It is a separate responsibility. It's a responsibility of the spirit and of the psyche. It's a responsibility of the soul. We are soul tending. We are spirit tending. We are psyche tending on different levels than the other professionals who work around us, but we work in conjunction with them. But it means we have to know and learn and honor the tools of the mystics of all time who have held this post before us. They have their healing practices. They have their divination practices. They have their astrological practices. They have their spiritual practices. They have their rituals. They have their processes of transformation. We must know all of these things. So I very, very much look forward to continue to bringing you more education about all of these various facets of spiritual leadership. And I'm excited that you are walking this journey with me and saying yes to filling your post as a spiritual leader. It is truly an honor to be here with you. So as always, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. And if you've enjoyed this discussion and want to hear more about it, we are actually talking about spiritual leadership and how to walk the walk of a spiritual leader in my highereducation.yoga membership this month, which I always invite you to take the $14day $1 trial by heading over to highereducation.yoga/trial. Come and join us. There's an incredible group of people who are just like you, ready to step into their roles as spiritual leaders. Again, it's $1 for 14 days, highereducation.yoga/trial. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, then please leave me a review wherever you found it, and it will help others to find this podcast too. And from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. Until then, namaste.